Prime Minister Scott Morrison has categorically ruled out intervening to allow a Tamil family to stay in Australia. The federal government is seeking to deport the family back to Sri Lanka, but lawyers are trying to argue the two children born in Australia should stay. Political reporter Matthew Doran has more from Parliament House.
Scott Morrison says that courts have repeatedly looked at this case and have repeatedly found that the parents in this case are not entitled to protection as refugees here in Australia. However, it must be pointed out that this latest legal challenge does focus more on the children that were born here in Australia rather than their parents, and that's why lawyers believe that they may be in with a shot to ensure that the family can stay in Australia rather than be deported back to Sri Lanka. They're currently being housed on Christmas Island, which is something that their supporters claim is an attempt to thwart the legal process and ensure that they don't have appropriate access to their legal team during this process. That is something that the government understandably denies, and unsurprisingly denies, I should say. But Scott Morrison says that he understands the compassion that's being shown by the Australian community here, particularly that from the regional town of Billawheeler in Queensland, where they have been living. He says that it's clear that they've made an impression on that community, but he's also concerned that any intervention by the Minister for Immigration, David Coleman here, would indeed send a message to people smugglers that there are ways to ensure vulnerable people who travel to Australia by boat can settle in Australia. Scott Morrison says he doesn't want to see that trade kickstart again, and under no circumstances will he direct David Coleman to intervene.
But they didn't come to the country in the appropriate way. They have not been found to have an asylum claim. And to have changed our policy on this, or to exercise intervention powers on this, would be to send exactly the wrong message to those who are looking to sell tickets to vulnerable people looking to get on boats. It would send them the exact wrong message, and that's not something that I in good conscience can allow to happen, and nor can my ministers.
The Prime Minister speaking earlier in Sydney. Now, Labor is campaigning for this family to be allowed to stay in Australia. The Shadow Home Affairs Minister, Christina Keneally, has also suggested that there is some coincidental timing here with the reports across the front pages of major newspapers today that a Sri Lankan asylum seeker boat, or an alleged Sri Lankan asylum seeker boat, was intercepted by Border Force officials in August, suggesting that that story appearing on the front pages of newspapers just when the nation is debating the merits of allowing this Tamil family to stay in Australia is suspicious. She also says that the government is simply not listening to the Australian community, and suggested maybe if they were Liberal donors or friends of the Liberal Party that were making these claims, that the minister might see fit to intervene.
I don't know, maybe the government's waiting for Gillan McLachlan to call up Peter Dutton and intervene the way that appears to have happened with those au pairs. I don't know what would motivate this government to act. They need to listen to the Australian people, and the Australian people are making their views very loudly heard.
And Matthew, Labor has a somewhat unlikely ally in this campaign in Barnaby Joyce.
It's rare for Barnaby Joyce to be on a unity ticket with the Labor Party on anything, but on this case, he says that the family should be allowed to stay in Australia. Barnaby Joyce argues that they have made a valuable contribution to the Billawheeler community and that compassion should be shown here. In his own unique way, he's likened it to a police officer pulling someone over as they sped to the hospital to deal with a medical emergency, saying it's clear that they have broken the law, but the police officer would show them some compassion there and let them off with a warning. And he says in this situation, the minister should do the same.
I know that Minister Dutton is in such a vexed position because the boats coming in from Sri Lanka, the decision that has been made that the parents were not qualified as asylum seekers, but that's the parents, not the children. And time has moved on.
That's the former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce speaking on Channel 7 this morning. His Nationals colleague, the Water Minister David Littleproud, says Barnaby Joyce is free to speak his mind as a backbencher, but it won't sway the government's policy.
Matt Doran there. And former Deputy Secretary of the Immigration Department, Abul Rizvi, says the refugee status of the family is totally irrelevant to ministerial discretion.
The question we have to ask is why. The first problem with the position the government's taken on this is that it is conflating two very separate issues. One is the refugee decision, and everyone understands that they have found to be not to be refugees. The second is the decision to use ministerial discretion. The criteria for ministerial discretion are quite separate and quite different. Indeed, to argue that because they have failed the refugee decision we won't use ministerial discretion is a nonsense, because the only time you'd use ministerial discretion is if they have failed the refugee decision.
And so the fact that they are pointing to that they have been assessed as not being asylum seekers, have they closed down that by very publicly stating it?
Well, I don't believe so. I think what we are looking here at is the question of whether Minister Coleman should exercise his discretion and allow the family to stay. There are two key issues here that have to be considered, and they are not related to the refugee decision. They are firstly a question of whether it is compelling and compassionate for the Australian government to intervene in the national interest. If you look at the volume of support from the Australian community, that is quite clearly the case. I have seen cases where far lesser levels of community support have been involved and ministers have intervened on the basis of that support.
Now, what's going on in the courts at the moment, is that concerning both of the daughters or just the 2-year-old, because her case for asylum hadn't yet been assessed?
My understanding, it's only the 2-year-old.
And so is there anything to suggest that her case would be assessed any differently to her sister?
Unlikely, I would say.
The suggestion by some that the public campaign that has surrounded this has hurt the family's chances of ministerial discretion. Do you agree that that could be the case?
No, I don't. If the government was going to intervene in this case, it would have intervened a year ago. Since then, their only opportunity has indeed been public pressure.
What about the claim that the father Nadez's travel records proves that he has no asylum case? Does that have any relevance now that he has obviously been assessed as
It is totally irrelevant to the ministerial discretion decision.
If an employer were to sponsor them, could they stay?
That would require the minister to enable them to stay, and he could do that, for example, by exercising his discretion to, for example, grant them a temporary work visa sponsored by an employer in Biloela. That would be entirely sensible way to go forward and entirely consistent with the government's policy of encouraging more people to settle in outback places such as Biloela.
When you say that Australia needs to find a way to humanely and cost-effectively deal with situations like this, what do you mean by that?
I mean we can't keep dealing with cases like this in the way that we have. The cost, both the human cost and the financial cost, is far too great. We currently have in Australia something in the order of 100,000 people who have either applied for asylum, have a temporary protection visa, or have failed their asylum claims. Surely the government is not going to deal with those people in the way it's dealt with this case.
Are you pointing there specifically to the Christmas Island move?
Well, certainly that's part of it. But this family has spent, I understand, over a year in a detention centre in Australia. Surely we're not going to put that many people in detention centres, are we?
If they're returned to Sri Lanka, do we have any idea what would happen to them upon arrival? And I don't mean persecution, but in terms of literally as they arrive, will they be put in any detention there?
I'm not sure whether they will be put in detention. I'm sure that they would be interviewed and asked questions, and the Sri Lankan authorities would then proceed according to Sri Lankan law. I'm in no position to comment on what Sri Lankan law is in this space.
The government has said this morning that nearly 1,500 Sri Lankans have been sent back to Sri Lanka under the same circumstances as this family. Is there any evidence that these people have faced persecution there?
As I said before, I don't think the persecution question is relevant. The question is ministerial discretion, and that relates to whether it's compelling and compassionate for the Australian government to intervene and whether it is in the Australian national interest to intervene. On my reading of the Minister's own guidelines in respect to ministerial intervention, this case meets the guidelines, unlike the two au pairs who clearly did not meet the guidelines, but the Minister did intervene.
So I think I can make a fairly educated guess about what you think about this front page story about a boat from Sri Lanka being intercepted, as the government says, in August.
Yes, well, I think we need to look at some of the evidence here. And I'm sorry if I might just take a little bit of time to explain a little bit of the history, because the evidence is actually quite compelling. When the former Howard government introduced turn-back policy. That was highly effective. Very, very few boats arrived after turn-back policy was introduced. Very few asylum seekers arriving by boat applied for asylum. That was despite the fact both Ruddock and Vanstone used their ministerial intervention powers very extensively. Large numbers of boat arrivals were resettled in Australia and in New Zealand. Boats did not start coming despite that. Since boat turn-back policy has been reintroduced by this government, we have had, once again, very few people actually arrive by boat and apply for asylum. That's despite the resettlement of large numbers of people in the United States and the bringing of almost 1,000 people to Australia for medical treatment. Boats haven't started coming. What does it tell us? It tells us turn-back policy is actually very effective.
So when the government points to push factors in Sri Lanka, should that be taken into any sort of account when talking about their discretion to let one family stay?
In this particular case, none whatsoever.
And do you think the move to Christmas Island is an attempt to thwart the legal process, as the lawyers have claimed?
Oh, I think what the government has done is legal. I'm not saying it's illegal. It's just an extraordinary waste of taxpayers' money, an ongoing waste of taxpayers' money in this case. By the way, it is relevant in this case that when these people are deported, and I believe it's now almost inevitable, they will leave and the government will place on them a debt to the Commonwealth to the value of all of the costs that have been incurred. That will be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly in the millions of dollars. This family has no chance of ever returning to Australia if they are deported.
So that debt will hang over their head if they should ever return to
Absolutely,
Australia?
it will. And I am sure this government will ensure that is totalled up and added onto the debt.